Tonight, we gather around the fire to share 4 chilling true stories from the heart of the wilderness. These are not campfire legends. Each tale is rooted in real events, experienced by campers who will never forget what happened in the dark. Experienced by campers who will never forget what happened in the dark. Each encounter you are about to hear is told with haunting detail, just as it happened. Some may leave you questioning what truly lurks in the darkness of the wild. Some may leave you questioning what truly lurks in the darkness of the wild. Our first true story takes us deep into the woods, where a group of friends gathered for a weekend of camping and laughter. The fire crackled, stories were told, and the forest pressed in with a heavy silence. One camper, Alex, seemed uneasy, glancing over his shoulder at the darkness beyond the tents. As the night deepened, strange whispers drifted through the trees. The group dismissed it as wind, until Alex stepped away from the fire, flashlight in hand, drawn by the voices. Minutes passed. The whispers grew louder, circling the camp. When the friends called out, only silence answered. Alex was gone. Panic set in. Flashlights swept the trees, searching for any sign. Shadows danced just out of reach, and the whispers never stopped. They searched until dawn, but Alex had vanished without a trace. Only his footprints remained, leading into the darkness, and then nothing. To this day, the group never found their friend. But every year when they returned to that spot, the whispers returned, soft, urgent, and calling a name in the dark. Some mysteries in the woods are never meant to be solved. Our second story begins not with a scream, but with a quiet sigh of relief. It follows a man named Alex, a seasoned outdoorsman who believed the wilderness was the only place one could find true silence. He sought refuge from the relentless noise of the city, from a life that had become a cacophony of demands and disappointments. For him, the deep pine woods of the Pacific Northwest were a sanctuary, a place to reset his soul. He chose a spot far from any marked trail, a small, secluded clearing surrounded by ancient, towering pines that seemed to scrape the very heavens. As he pitched his tent and built his fire, a profound sense of peace settled over him. The air was crisp, the scent of pine was intoxicating, and the only sound was the gentle crackle of the flames. He felt utterly, blissfully alone. But in the vast, indifferent wilderness, being alone is a fragile illusion, and silence can be deceiving. The first night passed as he expected. The fire kept the chill at bay, and the stars, unobscured by city lights, were a brilliant, scattered canopy. Yet, as he lay in his sleeping bag, a primal part of his brain, honed by years of experience in the wild, refused to fully rest. He heard the familiar sounds of the forest at night, the distant hoot of an owl, the rustle of some small creature in the undergrowth. But there were other sounds too, a single sharp crack of a heavy branch, far too deliberate for a falling limb. He told himself it was a deer, or perhaps a bear, and checked that his food was securely stored. Later, a profound stillness fell over the woods, a silence so complete it felt unnatural, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, listening for something he could not hear. He dismissed it as exhaustion playing tricks on his mind, and eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. The next day, the sun did little to burn away his lingering unease. While gathering firewood, he found a series of strange, deep gouges in the bark of an old pine, almost like claw marks. But they were too high up, and the pattern was unlike any animal he knew. He tried to shrug it off, but the image stayed with him. As dusk bled across the sky on the second night, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. It was a tangible pressure at the back of his neck, a prickling sensation that made him scan the impenetrable wall of trees surrounding his camp. The fire seemed to cast more shadows than light, and each one seemed to dance with a life of its own. He found himself talking to himself, his voice a small, hollow sound against the immense quiet. He heard what sounded like a faint whisper on the wind, a sibilant hiss that was there one moment and gone the next. He strained his ears but heard only the fire. He was a rational man, a man of logic. But logic was beginning to feel like a very thin shield against the encroaching darkness. On the third night, his shield shattered. The moon was a cold silver disk, casting long skeletal shadows through the pines. Alex was stoking the fire when a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision made him freeze. He slowly raised his head, his eyes scanning the tree line, and then he saw it. It wasn't hiding, not really. It was simply standing between two massive pines, a figure of impossible height and unsettling stillness. It was a silhouette, a void in the shape of a man, but stretched, elongated, as if its creator had a flawed understanding of human anatomy. It was so tall its head nearly brushed the lowest branches, and its limbs were unnaturally long and thin. It absorbed the moonlight, reflecting nothing. It was pure, absolute shadow. Frozen with a fear he had never known, Alex watched as the shadow paused, and then its head, a featureless oval of deeper black, turned slowly, deliberately, to face him. There was no sound, no crunch of pine needles, no disturbance of the air. It simply was. And it was looking right at him. Sleep was impossible. Alex sat with his back against a log, a hunting knife clutched in his hand, until the first gray light of dawn crept through the trees. The figure was gone. He spent the day in a state of high alert, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? A trick of the light? A product of isolation-induced paranoia? He was miles from his car, deep in unforgiving territory. Packing up and hiking out in the dark was a death sentence. He had to wait for morning. But another part of him, the part that saw the impossible silhouette, knew that what he saw was real. The day was a torment of indecision and fear. The woods no longer felt like a sanctuary. They felt like a cage, and he was beginning to realize he was not the apex predator here. The fourth night arrived with a sense of grim inevitability. He built the fire larger, a blazing beacon against the oppressive dark. He didn't have to wait long. It appeared again, this time closer. It didn't walk or run. It glided from the shadow of one tree to the next with a fluid, unnatural grace that defied physics. Its movements were silent, seamless. It circled his camp, a predator studying its prey, always staying just at the edge of the fire's reach. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drum in the suffocating silence. He felt a terrifying, cold intelligence emanating from the thing. This was not some mindless beast. It was aware. It was curious, and it was testing him. Unable to bear its silent scrutiny any longer, he scrambled into his tent, zipping it shut, as if the thin layer of nylon could offer any real protection. It was a mistake. Plunged into the relative darkness of the tent, his other senses screamed to life. He could no longer see it, but he could feel its presence, a palpable drop in temperature just outside. Then, the sound started. A soft, rhythmic crunch of footsteps circling his tent, slow and deliberate. Crunch, pause, crunch, pause. Heart pounding, Alex pressed his ear to the fabric. The footsteps stopped. Silence. He held his breath, listening. A soft, wet scratching sound began on the side of the tent, like a long fingernail being dragged slowly down the rain fly. He recoiled, stifling a scream. And then the shadow fell upon the tent wall. Its outline, stark and black against the moonlit fabric, loomed over him. It was right there. He could see the impossible length of its limbs, the featureless shape of its head. It lingered, a silent, terrifying sentinel, its presence a weight that seemed to crush the very air from his lungs. He must have passed out from sheer terror, for he awoke to the birdsong of a new day. The shadow was gone. Scrambling out of the tent, he saw the evidence of his visitor. Deep footprints, far too large and narrow for a man or a bear, marked the soft earth in a perfect circle around his tent. They had only 2 long, pointed toes. In the center of the circle, the ashes of his fire pit, which had been a scattered mess, were now swirled into a perfect tight spiral, a cold, clear message, a signature. This was not a dream. This was not his imagination. This was real, and it was toying with him. That was the final straw. He knew he couldn't survive another night. As dusk began to fall, a thick, unnatural fog rolled in, swallowing the forest and muffling all sound. The moon vanished. The world shrank to just his immediate campsite. He was packing his gear with frantic, clumsy hands when he heard it. A soft crunch, not in the distance, but right behind him. He spun around, flashlight beam cutting through the mist. The figure stood less than 10 feet away, a towering column of blackness within the gray fog. It was no longer watching. It was no longer circling. It had crossed the boundary. It raised one of its long, spindly arms, and for the first time, Alex heard a sound from it, a low, guttural clicking that vibrated in his bones. He didn't scream. The sound was trapped in his throat. He simply dropped everything, turned, and ran. He crashed blindly through the trees, the fog disorienting him, branches whipping his face and tearing at his clothes. He didn't dare look back, but he could feel the pursuit, a swift, silent presence that kept pace with him effortlessly. There was no sound of heavy footfalls, only the chilling feeling of being herded, of being allowed to run. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs gave out, collapsing at the edge of a dirt road as the sun finally rose. He never looked back. He was found hours later by a park ranger, dehydrated, covered in scratches, and babbling about a shadow in the pines. They called it exposure and exhaustion. But Alex knew what he saw. He abandoned his career, his apartment, his life. He moved to the desert, a place with no tall trees, no deep woods. But sometimes in the dead of night, when the silence is absolute, he still hears it. A soft, wet scratching at his window. And he knows with a certainty that chills him to his very soul that some shadows, once they see you, never stop looking. The wilderness holds secrets far older than humanity. It does not always welcome visitors. So if you ever find yourself camping alone deep among the ancient pines, and a silence falls that feels too heavy, too complete, pay attention. Beware the feeling of being watched from the tree line. Beware the shadows that move when there is no wind. And if you see a figure that is too tall, too thin, too dark, run. Because some things in the woods are better left unseen. And some shadows, once they find you, will follow you home. Our third story takes us to Blackwood Lake, a place whispered about in local lore, but largely forgotten by the outside world. It was here that the Peterson family, Mark, Sarah, and their 2 young children, Leo and Maya, sought a genuine escape. They were tired of curated campgrounds and the noise of civilization. They craved the profound silence of the true wilderness, a place to reconnect under a canopy of stars. They found the lake on an old topographical map in Mark's grandfather's study, a speck of blue so remote it promised absolute solitude. As they navigated the overgrown logging road, the dense forest canopy created a tunnel of green, shutting out the world behind them. Arriving at the lake, their first impression was one of breathtaking beauty. The water was a sheet of dark glass, perfectly mirroring the ancient pines that crowded its shores. The air was crisp and clean. For a few blissful hours, it was paradise. They set up their tent, the children's laughter echoing in the vast emptiness. But as the sun began to dip below the tree line, a change occurred. A thick, unnaturally cold mist began to rise from the center of the lake. It didn't drift in from the edges. It materialized from the depths, rolling across the surface like a living thing, swallowing the scenery and muffling all sound. The peace they had craved began to feel like isolation, and the quiet started to feel like a held breath, waiting for something to break it. On their first night, they huddled close to the crackling campfire, its light a tiny bastion against the encroaching darkness and the thick, swirling fog. Sarah was pointing out constellations to the children while Mark poked at the logs, a contented smile on his face. The only sounds were the fire, the chirping of crickets, and the distant hoot of an owl. It was in a moment of perfect stillness that the sound came. It wasn't an animal cry. It was a human scream, a woman's scream, ripped from the throat with such agony and terror that it seemed to tear the fabric of the night. It echoed from the far side of the lake, amplified by the water and the oppressive fog, impossibly loud and piercing. Every muscle in their bodies seized. Leo dropped the marshmallow stick he was holding into the fire. Maya buried her face in her mother's jacket. Mark, his heart hammering against his ribs, grabbed their most powerful flashlight and aimed its beam across the water. But the light was useless, swallowed by the impenetrable wall of white mist just a few feet from the shore. The scream held for what felt like an eternity, then was abruptly cut off, plunging them into a silence that was now heavy, menacing, and utterly absolute. "It was a fox," Mark said, his voice strained, trying to sound confident for the children. "Or maybe a bobcat. They can make some crazy sounds." But he didn't believe it. Sarah didn't either. The sound had been saturated with a distinctly human despair. They quickly extinguished the fire, the darkness pressing in on them, and retreated to the perceived safety of the tent. They tried to reassure the children, whispering comforting lies about wildlife. But the fear was a palpable presence inside the thin nylon walls. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent fresh waves of adrenaline through them. Sleep was impossible. They lay there for hours, listening to the silence, their eyes fixed on the tent flap, imagining what might be moving through the mist. The fog was so dense it seemed to press against the fabric, cold and damp, making the small space feel like a tomb. Every glance was drawn back towards the direction of the lake, towards the black, invisible water that had birthed such a terrifying sound. The next morning, the sun burned away the mist, revealing the lake in its placid, deceptive beauty. The family debated leaving, but the desire not to let fear ruin their trip, coupled with the harsh light of day, made the night's terror feel distant, almost imagined. Mark spent the morning circling the accessible parts of the shoreline, looking for tracks, a campsite, any sign of another person. He found nothing. The ground was undisturbed. The lake itself seemed unnervingly still, its dark water absorbing the sunlight without reflection. They tried to salvage the day, but a heavy anxiety hung over them. The children stayed close, their games forgotten. As dusk approached, a sense of dread descended with the temperature. The mist rose again from the lake, thicker this time. They built the fire larger, a desperate act of defiance. And then it happened again. This time it wasn't one scream, but two, a woman's and a man's. They were closer, seeming to come not from the middle of the lake itself. The screams were longer, interwoven with frantic, choked gasps. As they stared, paralyzed, at the wall of fog, they saw it, ripples, spreading silently from the center of the lake in perfect, ever-widening circles. But there had been no splash, no sound of anything entering or leaving the water. It was as if something enormous had simply surfaced and then submerged without disturbing the air. That was the breaking point. The sight of those causeless ripples was more terrifying than the screams. The next morning, Mark told Sarah he was going for help, a flimsy excuse for his real mission, to find answers. He drove the hour-long trip to the nearest town, a sleepy, dilapidated place called Hemlock Creek. The few locals he encountered at the general store grew quiet and evasive when he mentioned Blackwood Lake. In the town's tiny, musty library, an elderly librarian reluctantly pointed him toward the archives. For hours, he sifted through brittle, yellowed newspapers on a microfiche reader, and then he found it. A series of articles from 1978. The headlines told a grim story. Crawford family missing at Blackwood Lake. Boat found capsized. No sign of survivors. A family of 4, a husband, wife, and their 2 young children, had vanished during a sudden, violent storm that had appeared out of nowhere on a clear summer day. Their bodies were never recovered. The final article quoted the sheriff, who called the lake a place that doesn't like to give up its dead. It was accompanied by a faded photograph of the smiling Crawford family, a haunting mirror of his own. Mark drove back to the campsite with a cold stone of dread in his stomach. He showed Sarah the printed articles, his hands shaking. They knew they had to leave, but a storm was now brewing, the sky turning a bruised purple. They decided to wait for first light. It was a decision they would regret for the rest of their lives. That night, the horror escalated beyond anything they could have imagined. The screams began just after midnight, but now they were laced with words. "Help me!" a woman shrieked from the water. "I can't hold on!" a man gargled. And most terrifyingly, a child's voice crying, "Mommy! Where are you, Mommy?" The sounds were accompanied by violent, frantic splashing, as if a desperate struggle was happening just beyond the shore. They huddled in the tent, Maya and Leo sobbing silently. Then came a new sound, a wet slapping noise on the mud right outside their tent. Footsteps, heavy and waterlogged. They circled the tent, once, twice. The family held their breath, frozen in absolute terror. Suddenly, the nylon wall beside Mark's head pushed inward, the distinct shape of a hand pressing against it before retracting. A moment later, they heard a faint metallic scratching at the zipper of the tent door, a fumbling, persistent attempt to get in. That was it. There was no more waiting for dawn. In a blind panic, Mark and Sarah threw their children and a few bags into the car, abandoning their tent, their supplies, everything. They scrambled into the vehicle, Mark fumbling with the keys, his fingers slick with sweat. He turned the key. Nothing, just a click. He tried again, a choked, sputtering sound. "No, no, no, please," Sarah whispered, staring into the darkness behind them. On the third try, the engine roared to life. Mark slammed the car into gear and tore down the dirt road, branches scraping against the sides of the vehicle. He didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. As they fishtailed onto the main road, leaving the oppressive darkness of the lake behind, a final sound reached them, carried on the wind. It wasn't a scream this time. It was a whisper, a chorus of ethereal voices that seemed to come from right inside the car. And it whispered a single chilling word: stay. The Peterson family never spoke of Blackwood Lake again, not even to each other. The shared trauma was a silent, festering wound. They sold their camping gear and moved to a new city a year later, seeking the anonymous comfort of urban noise. But there is no escape. Mark is still haunted by the guilt of leading his family to that place. Sarah suffers from crippling insomnia, terrified of the silence of the night. The children, now teenagers, have no conscious memory of the specific events, only a deep, inexplicable fear of dark water and fog. Sometimes, on the quietest of nights when the world is asleep, Mark swears he can still hear it. Not the screams from his dreams, but the faint, waterlogged sound of something scratching at a door, a desperate, lonely plea to be let in. The lake is still there, on that old map, waiting patiently. The locals in Hemlock Creek say the water keeps its secrets and its victims, and that sometimes when it gets lonely it calls out for more. Our fourth story begins not with novices, but with seasoned campers, Liam and Chloe. For them, the wilderness was not a place of fear, but of refuge, a sanctuary from the noise and pressure of city life. They sought out the most remote locations, places untouched by trails and tourists, where the silence was absolute. This time they chose Blackwood Forest, a vast, primeval expanse of woods rumored to be so deep and dense that sunlight struggled to pierce its canopy, even at midday. They hiked for hours, pushing deeper than they ever had before, until the last vestiges of civilization were a distant memory. They found a small, secluded clearing, a perfect pocket of peace by a meandering creek. As they set up their tent and gathered firewood, the forest seemed to welcome them. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. They felt a profound sense of accomplishment, of having truly escaped. They believed they were utterly and completely alone. But the deep woods keep their own secrets, and as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and violet, they would learn that they were trespassers in a place that did not want them there. As twilight bled into true night, they sat by the crackling campfire, its warmth a welcome shield against the encroaching chill. The forest settled into its nocturnal rhythm, the gentle murmur of the creek, the chirping of crickets, the distant mournful call of an owl. Yet, beneath these familiar sounds, a new quality emerged in the silence that followed. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, the kind that makes the hairs on your arms stand up. Liam, ever the pragmatist, tried to ignore it, focusing on the mesmerizing dance of the flames. But Chloe couldn't shake a creeping unease. It started as a faint prickle on the back of her neck, the primitive, undeniable sensation of being watched. She scanned the impenetrable wall of trees surrounding their small bubble of light, seeing nothing but shifting shadows. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, her voice tight. A twig had snapped in the darkness, a sharp, clean break, too loud for a squirrel, too deliberate for a falling branch. Liam paused, listening. "Probably just a deer," he said, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. The feeling didn't subside. It intensified, growing from a subtle whisper in the back of their minds to a palpable presence pressing in from the darkness. It was Chloe who saw them first. Her gaze drifted to a particularly dark patch of woods just beyond the fire's reach. And there, suspended in the blackness, were 2 points of light. They weren't the warm, reflective shine of a deer's eyes caught in the firelight. These were self-luminous, a cold, phosphorescent green, and they stared with an unblinking, intelligent stillness that was utterly alien. They didn't move, they didn't waver, they just watched. "Liam," she breathed, her hand gripping his arm. "Look, over there." He followed her gaze, and his casual dismissal died on his lips. He saw them too. A knot of ice formed in his stomach. For a long moment, they both sat frozen, mesmerized by the silent, malevolent stare. Rationality fought against instinct. It had to be an animal, a bobcat, maybe an owl. But no owl they knew of stared with such unnerving fixity from the forest floor. Breaking the spell, Liam fumbled for his high-powered flashlight. "I'll scare it off," he muttered, his voice a low growl of forced confidence. He thumbed the switch, and a brilliant white beam sliced through the night, striking the spot where the eyes had been. There was nothing there, just a tangle of ferns and the thick trunk of an ancient oak tree. He swept the beam back and forth, probing the darkness, but the woods remained empty and still. A wave of relief, fragile and thin, washed over him. "See? Gone," he said, clicking the light off. For a heartbeat, there was only darkness, and then they returned, not in the same spot. They were closer now, and there were no longer two eyes, but four. Two distinct pairs floating side by side, their cold green light seeming to mock the flashlight's brief intrusion. The blood drained from their faces. This wasn't an animal. Animals fled from light and noise. This was something else. Panic began to set in, a cold, sharp-edged fear that stole their breath. They stared in horrified fascination as another pair of eyes ignited in the darkness to the left of the first two, then another to the right, and another, and another. Within a minute, the entire tree line that encircled their camp was filled with them. Dozens upon dozens of small, glowing green eyes, all identical, all perfectly still, all fixed on the two of them. They formed a silent, watching jury, a semicircle of disembodied gazes that held no curiosity, only a chilling, patient intensity. It felt like the forest itself had opened its eyes to stare at them. Heart pounding in his chest, Liam grabbed the flashlight again, shining it wildly into the woods. As before, the instant the light touched them, the eyes vanished, swallowed by the absolute blackness. But the moment he turned the light off, they reappeared, a silent, instantaneous return. And each time they seemed to have crept forward, their perimeter shrinking, tightening the invisible net around the tiny island of firelight. A primal terror finally broke their paralysis. "The tent! Now!" Liam yelled, and they scrambled from their logs, abandoning the fire and diving into their small nylon dome. Liam fumbled with the zipper, his hand shaking so badly it took 3 tries to pull it shut. They huddled together in the center of the tent, the thin fabric feeling like the most pathetic armor imaginable. Outside, the world went silent. The crickets stopped chirping. The owl was no longer calling. The very air seemed to have been stripped of sound, creating a vacuum of terrifying silence. The feeling of being watched was now more intense than ever, as if the eyes were pressed right against the tent walls, their gaze piercing the thin material. Suddenly, a shadow fell over the tent, momentarily eclipsing the faint moonlight that filtered through the rainfly. There were no clouds in the sky. Then came a sound, a soft dragging noise like heavy cloth being pulled over dry leaves, slowly circling their tent. It stopped. They held their breath, listening. A soft deliberate came against the nylon, right beside Chloe's head. She let out a choked sob and scrambled away from the wall. Then another tap, on the opposite side. They were being toyed with, examined by something just inches away, something they couldn't see. The hours that followed were the purest form of torment. They didn't speak, didn't dare to move. They just sat in the suffocating darkness of the tent, listening. Every rustle of a leaf, every groan of a tree branch was magnified into a monstrous threat. Their minds, starved of sensory input, began to create their own horrors, imagining the forms attached to those terrible, unblinking eyes. They felt a presence so immense and ancient it seemed to soak into their very bones, a malevolent consciousness that had been there long before they arrived and would remain long after they were gone. Sleep was an impossible luxury. Every time their exhausted eyes started to close, the image of those green lights would flash behind their eyelids, and the feeling of that silent, patient gaze would jolt them back to terrified wakefulness. Just when they thought they couldn't endure another second, a subtle shift occurred. A faint gray light began to seep into the tent. Dawn was breaking. As the light grew, the oppressive weight on the atmosphere began to lift, slowly, reluctantly, like a physical pressure being released. With trembling hands, Liam unzipped the tent flap a few inches and peered out. The clearing was empty. The eyes were gone. They didn't wait. They burst from the tent and began packing with a frantic, desperate energy, throwing gear into their packs with no regard for order. Their movements were jerky, their faces pale and gaunt from a night without sleep. Neither of them dared to look directly at the tree line, keeping their eyes fixed on the task at hand. They didn't look for footprints or tracks. A part of them knew with dreadful certainty that they would find none. The ground around the tent was pristine, undisturbed. It was as if nothing had been there at all. Leaving the dying embers of their fire behind, they fled the clearing and began the long hike back, moving as fast as they could, the silence of the forest now feeling accusatory, mocking. They didn't speak on the trail. They didn't speak on the long, silent drive home. There were no words for what they had experienced. It was a shared trauma, a secret that would forever bind them in a pact of terrified silence. They never camped again. The wilderness, once their sanctuary, was now a place of profound dread. But the experience didn't stay in Blackwood Forest. It followed them home. Sometimes, late at night when they're alone in a quiet house, that old familiar prickle will return to the back of their necks. They'll see a flicker of movement in a dark corner, or feel a sudden, inexplicable chill. The fear has become a part of them, a permanent scar on their psyche. And in their dreams, they often find themselves back by that campfire, surrounded by the deep, impenetrable dark. And always, from the edge of that darkness, the eyes are there, dozens of them, silent, patient, and waiting.